Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating intersection of urbanization, public health, and ecology in the Russian Empire during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Specifically, we're going to look at the historical water crisis of Staraya Russa, which was this prominent provincial and resort town in the Novgorod province. For those of you researching or studying ecological history, this case study is just a perfect example of how modernizing societies grapple with environmental decay. Because we aren't just looking at this as a story about engineering, we're going to examine it as a pivotal moment in the evolution of ecological consciousness. Let's get started.
Here's a quick roadmap of where we're headed. We'll start with the paradox of the city's water supply, then look at the Cherepovets Spring, the eventual infrastructure collapse, the failure of early laws, the struggle to build modern waterworks, and finally, what this all means for ecological consciousness.
All right, part 1. The paradox of abundant, dirty water.
When you look at the geography of Staraya Russa, there's a really striking historical irony right off the bat. The city is fundamentally defined by water. As you can see, it sits right around 3 significant rivers, the Palist, the Porusia, and the Peretitsa. Now, for a growing provincial town that was also a military garrison and a mineral water resort, you'd probably think this abundance of surface water was a huge blessing, right? It gave them transport, natural boundaries, and great scenery. But from a public health standpoint, it was an absolute nightmare. The city was completely surrounded by water, but literally almost none of it was drinkable.
The surface water was essentially ruined by a devastating mix of industrial and agricultural runoff. Take the river Polis, for example. It had a distinctly salty taste because it was constantly polluted by runoff from a local salt plant. The Porusia and Peretitsa rivers, they had incredibly high levels of organic waste, basically because the villages upstream treated them like open sewers. And then you had Lake Azovskoye in the southeast. This wasn't a scenic lake. It was a stagnant hazard that gave off overwhelming sulfur odors, just filled with rotting organic matter, infusoria, and hydrogen sulfide compounds. This wasn't just a nuisance, it was a massive epidemiological ticking time bomb for the people living there.
Moving on to part 2, the underground spring of Cherepovets. So faced with all this toxic surface water, the city's early 19th century solution wasn't to actually clean the rivers. Instead, they just bypassed them. Back in the winter of 1825 to 1826, they discovered a pristine underground spring in the village of Cherepovets, which is about 3 versts, so roughly 3 kilometers outside of Staraya Russa. To tap into this, the city pulled off a pretty impressive logistical feat for the time. They laid down a dedicated network of wooden pipes to bring that water straight into the city. And by 1848, this water was being actively distributed to the public, mostly drawn from a central well over at Vivinskaya Square.
The key takeaway here is just how radically different this water was from the rivers. According to historical chemical analyses, the Cherepovets spring water was a total revelation. It was highly transparent, it had almost zero organic matter, and it only showed the faintest traces of ammonia and nitric acid. For decades, this underground lifeline was the only thing saving the citizens of Staraya Russa from the deadly, polluted water flowing right through their own streets.
Which brings us to part 3, population growth and infrastructure collapse.
As any urban historian listening knows, static infrastructure almost never survives a dynamic demographic boom. And the data from the late 19th century shows a classic inverse relationship that spells absolute disaster. Notice how fast the population is growing here, from around 9,500 people in the mid-19th century to over 16,000 by the early 1900s. But now, look at the daily water supply from the Cherepovets spring. In 1849, the city was getting a very solid 12,000 buckets a day. But just 5 years later, in 1854, it dropped to 5,400 buckets. By the turn of the century, even though the population had nearly doubled, the daily water supply had totally crashed to just 3,500 to 4,000 buckets.
So, what happened? Why did this vital lifeline completely collapse? Well, it was a mix of mechanical failure and, quite frankly, human interference. Think about it. You've got half a century of natural decay slowly eating away at these wooden pipes, causing them to leak pressure and volume. But on top of that physical deterioration, local residents living along the pipeline started illegally drilling holes straight into the wood to siphon off water for themselves. This depressurized the whole system, which caused that massive drop in volume reaching the city center. Worse still, it completely destroyed the water's purity. By 1893, an analysis by Dr. P.A. Malchevsky showed that by the time the spring water actually reached Staraya Russa, organic matter had spiked 4-fold and ammonia levels had doubled. That pristine spring had literally become a vector for disease.
Let's dive into Part 4, the failure of early ecological laws.
Local authorities obviously realized things were spiraling out of control, so they tried to legislate their way out of the problem. In 1876, the Staraya Russa City Public Administration rolled out these obligatory resolutions aimed at cleaning up urban sanitation. These were incredibly strict local decrees. They outright banned citizens from dumping dead animals, garbage, and dirty snow into the rivers. They went after local industry, telling tanneries and dye shops they could no longer wash their chemically treated materials in the Polisti and Prititsa rivers. They even made private well owners legally responsible for protecting their water sources from surface contamination.
But there was a fatal flaw in all this. As scholar A.B. Agafonova notes, these measures were pretty much doomed from day one because of how 19th century municipal policy worked. She points out that the limitations imposed by local decrees could not solve the pollution problems because the latter were not limited to the city limits. The city council had literally zero jurisdiction over the countless villages upstream that were still just dumping raw organic waste right into the waterways. It's really a textbook example of how local environmental laws are basically powerless against macro-regional pollution flows.
On to Part 5, the long road to the waterworks.
With the laws failing and those wooden pipes rotting in the ground, a massive technological upgrade was really the only option left on the table, and the final push came from an escalating public health disaster. The terrible water quality started causing lethal typhoid outbreaks. And remember, this wasn't just a problem for the everyday provincial residents. Staraya Russa had a crucial military garrison and a very lucrative mineral water resort. These outbreaks were threatening soldiers and wealthy resort guests alike. The solution became undeniably clear. They had to completely rip out the old, rotten wooden lines and urgently build a modern metal-piped waterworks system.
But of course, structural modernization always comes with a massive price tag. In 1895, the City Duma brought in engineer M.I. Altakov to calculate the cost of a brand new system. The estimate he came back with? 150,000 rubles. For a provincial town in the Russian Empire at the turn of the century, that was an astronomical, totally crushing financial burden. The municipality just did not have the capital to do it on their own.
What happened next is a deeply frustrating decade of bureaucratic red tape, where local public health was basically held hostage by imperial geopolitics. In 1898, the city tried to issue municipal bonds to raise the money, but the central government blocked it. In the early 1900s, local authorities literally pleaded with the Ministry of Finance for a 50-year loan. The ministry actually agreed that the waterworks were absolutely essential to stop the disease outbreaks, but they denied the funds anyway. Why? Because the empire was in the middle of the Russo-Japanese War and was enforcing extreme economic austerity everywhere. It wasn't until August 31st, 1908, way after the war was over, that the emperor finally approved a 15-year loan, and even then, it was only for 1/3 of the requested funds, to just try and jumpstart the project.
Despite all those severe delays, the end result was a massive triumph of municipal engineering. Just look at this water tower. It completely changed the city's skyline, standing tall over Trade Square as this ultimate symbol of modern hygiene. It officially opened on November 8, 1909, finally replacing the rotting wooden infrastructure of the past. And by 1910, just a year after it opened, the centralized system was running flawlessly, pumping out an incredible 9 million buckets of clean water a year.
What's also truly fascinating is the social equity that was built right into this new grid. Out of those 9 million buckets distributed in 1910, 5 million were paid for by private homes and businesses hooked up to the system. But look at this, an impressive 4 million buckets. So nearly half the entire volume were given out to the poorest citizens of Staraya Russa entirely for free through a network of public standpipes. It was a huge leap forward, not just for urban engineering, but for public health equity across class divides.
Which leads us to our final section, the birth of ecological consciousness. Let's zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture here. Agafonova's research offers a really compelling theoretical takeaway about this era. She argues that Russian society in the late 19th and early 20th centuries didn't actually solve their environmental problems, they just engineered their way around them. By reaching further out to the pristine Cherepovets springs with newer, much more expensive technology, they minimized their local discomfort. They expanded their extraction footprint rather than actually fixing the root cause of the decay in their own rivers. The Poliest and Prititsa remained just as polluted as before. The city simply stopped drinking from them.
So I want to leave you with a question to ponder as we think about ecological history. Did this massive technological triumph, building this incredible water tower and a sprawling modern grid, Did it represent a true awakening of ecological consciousness? Or was it really just a more efficient way to exploit nature and dodge the severe consequences of unregulated urban sprawl? When we look at how modern cities manage their resources today, the story of Staraya Russa strongly suggests that real environmental progress requires a lot more than just laying down better pipes. It requires actually confronting pollution directly at the source. Thank you for joining me for this explainer.